So thank you for that. And I'm going to try and dive a little bit deeper into the Upanishadic side of that equation, although I love the ritual side with the imaginative construction of a new self. But the Upanishadic conception is a version that is, I think, one of the world's most influential, one of the world's most developed conceptions of a second self that we have, which is higher, which is eternal, and which should be sought. So it's an important historical touchstone. We see it in the concept of Atman, the self. We see it in the practices of yoga. We see it in the elevation of knowledge, jnana, as a really essential part of religious, of life. Not religious is almost an unhelpful word, of the transformation of self, which all people, regardless of circumstance, should be aiming at in one way or another. What I want to do is engage in a little bit of a detective story into the roots of this concept in India and into the branches that it took, because of course it's not one idea. There's a simplification of something that is extremely diverse and complex. And one of the things I want to bring out is the idea that the second of the double self, the second self, the higher self, is not one thing. There should be, in fact, a range of choices of upper self that we can choose among. So there's almost a portfolio, a deck of cards, different versions that are available to us, and not merely a single journey of ascent. So we're going to look at that. So the double soul, looking other way, ancient origins, there we go. And I want to engage in the idea that there's a detective story to be undertaken into the origin of the idea. And we're looking fairly early. I think if you want to look at the earliest Vedic sources that engage with cosmology, with selfhood, with metaphysics, of spiritual practice, you're looking at perhaps book 10 of the Rig Veda, Aranyaka's Atharva Veda, maybe even as late as 1000 BC. And there's an ongoing mystery and scholarship about where we find the origins of these kinds of ideas that become so central to shaping the whole of the Indian tradition. Is it in ancestor worship? Of course, that's a universal, very, very widespread practice, almost universal practice, that everyone already believes that ancestors remain with us and that the post-mortem world has its own presence among us. And much practice, of course, in these cultures was about engaging with our ancestors. They're all across India, Southeast Asia, and Asia, most of the world. Is it in the sacrifices that were done, classic Mediterranean, ancient Near Eastern sacrifices of offerings on an altar to the world of the gods, and the way that that eventually became less of a public activity and more of an internal process? Is it simply the internalization of sacrifice? Is it the idea that over time, what people wanted from the gods elevated in value? So originally they talk of cows. The first Vedic hymns, we want cows. We also want sons, never daughters. We want rain. Rain is really important. Eventually, you can see society developing as metalwork and so on develops. They want treasures. Treasures become, in a sense, the new form of wealth. Is it that they simply eventually said all of these things, we've got enough of it now that we're in cosmopolitan, urban, axial age civilizations, and now we want the best treasure, immortality? Is it that there was a shamanic influence that was certainly there? Is it part of a wider Gnostic movement of ideas about a separation of selfhood in a higher world? Is it coming out of metaphysics and the rise of processes of inference and thinking and rationality, which of course is cluing them in to the ability of the mind to find hidden truths everywhere, to discover what they point to as eternal, immortal, timeless, changeless realities? Is it the product of this extraordinary new practice, which is meditative practice, meditative exploration of the inner world? And we get some really striking senses of this duality that does emerge. One of the earliest schools of Indian thought is a school called Samkhya, which was linked to yoga. And they really saw the self and all reality as two different kinds of thing. On the one hand, there was the Purusha, the pure spirit. On the other hand, there was Prakriti, the worldly forms that make up everything around us. Earliest forms of Sankhya seem to have only believed in worldly elements that come together and shape our world and shape ourselves. They had a notion of simply the self as that which grasps together the elements of body and nature. And you can immerse yourself back into nature as a form of liberation. And Buddhism says, yeah, there is no higher self. So there are a number of ancient traditions that had no other, no double, no higher. It was working with the materials we have. So whence comes the second self? And certainly one of the answers may be that there was a metaphysical dimension to this that arises out of the development of philosophy in ancient India, particularly in the Brahminical tradition, but also beyond. Inference. There's a lot of texts. If you're a big nerd and you love to study philosophy and metaphysics and the development of quite technical forms of philosophy, the realization that you can use your mind to reason about and access these higher truths becomes very important for revealing a subtle, sukshma world of ideas, language, causation, desire, etc. They speculate on natural forces. They're really interested in empirical observation of the world and also of the mental building blocks that make up mind. So it takes us into a kind of proto-psychology. And all of this lets philosophy do something extraordinary. And at some point in history, they also develop a notion of not only empirical observation out, but in, swaprakasha, the illumination of the self. Swasamvedana, the realization that all we do is within the self. So early transcendental arguments, which are realizing that selfhood is the locus of the world as we know it. It's kind of like proto-Husserl, something like that, proto-Kant, right, is happening at a very, very early stage. So philosophy is taking you to an inner self quite apart from some of the spiritual practices and yogic practices that we might think of. But there is also what I'm going to call a phenomenological dimension. And if you read the Yoga Sutras, they're in a million different translations, beautiful texts. It has a kind of a phenomenological self-reflection. Look within, watch the self. One of the Upanishads says, the senses look outwards, but a wise man learns to turn his senses inward, like a lamp illuminating itself. So this idea that as people begin to take up this practice of yoga, of meditation, they realize the permanence of consciousness, but also its malleability, that we can direct our attention in different ways, that thought has different permutations, textures, and characteristics, vrittis, that you can scale the self from me right now, me and my body perhaps, me and my memory, me and my whole lifespan, me and my community, me and the world. So the self has different sizes and different affective flavors, that there's not only, as Jeremy Bentham said, sukha and dukkha, pleasure and pain, but there's also bliss and other emotions that we can cultivate, moods, that flavor and color the self that we are. And very important, I think, it realizes that the self that we construct to recur like a narrative self, a Jessica Fraser and the kind of person she is totally contingent. And of course, this is amplified by a belief in reincarnation. Really important that if you have that belief, the narrative self is always something that you should be able to step beyond, because it's always obviously not totally definitive of you. So we have these different aspects. And different scholars have tried to explain that. Karl Potter recently died, talked about the whole of India as concerned with the human condition of being dependent on things and wanting to become free. And he says the self is the place where we can become free of all that locks us in. Mircea Eliade talked about our sense of a form, certain forms of existence or tones, tenors, textures of existence that feel to us higher and of greater integrity, that we have a nostalgia for, that we want to return to. William Mahoney talks about the idea that we see ourselves as small, but we also see ourselves as connected with the larger cosmos, and that desire to reconnect with the great forces of the world that we're in is the motivating factor. Olivelle talks about social change and the push between kind of socially orthodox householders and socially unorthodox renouncers. Janardhan Ganeri says it becomes a kind of a puzzle, the self, almost like Zeno's paradoxes. It inspires people to look for more and more ideas, theories. It becomes a kind of philosophical and spiritual generator for ideas in the Indian world. And Jan Hiesterman kind of points to the Stoic aspect. In a pastoral world where you're constantly fearful of storm, of flood, of disease, we can see clear indications, if you look at the Atharva Veda's spells, of all the fears that people had. Every woman could die in childbirth. Every king was fearful of rebellion. Then at some point there's a rise to think of what it is that could free us from all of that. Where is the world that we can get relief and escape to immortality? And I think already from a very early stage, I won't go through all of this, but the Atharva Veda has a beautiful hymn where the poet stops calling to the gods for a second, stops analyzing, diagnosing the forces of the cosmos for a second, and says, "What thing I am, I know not clearly. Mysterious, bound, I wander in the mind." Beautiful, beautiful quote. And it's just in there. It's very much a personal, direct expression of a kind of existential curiosity you find early on. They try to explain this with reference to many elements, all of which become praised as essences of the self. And over time, this develops into the notion of a kind of inner doppelganger, right? The other self. And we see it again and again in the Upanishads, in the Chandogya Upanishad. Here in this fort of Brahman, the divine, the absolute, in the fort of Brahman here is the self. There is a small lotus, a dwelling place, and within it a small space. And in that space there is something, and that's what you should try to discover. That's what you should seek to perceive. The sense that what we have around us and what we have here, the smallest point within has the greatest treasure, the most valuable secret. And it says you can find this quite easily. The phenomenology comes into play. You can't see the seer who does the seeing. You can't see the hearer who does the hearing. You can't think of the thinker who does the thinking, or the perceiver who does the perceiving. But that's what we have to try and do. So it's actually a reverse causation, right? Can we go back into the roots of thought itself? And that gives rise to this image, which I think we also find in parts of Plato, perhaps in the Phaedo. Know the self as a rider in a chariot, and the body as simply the chariot, right? So we have a sense of a double that we need to find. This turns into a whole cultural quest and a sense that their riddles abound. India often thought in terms of riddles and dialogues and questions and answers, which gives a kind of drama to it, a drama of spiritual discovery, of philosophical exploration, and a kind of a social setting for thinking about these things that not everyone had. So the riddles are important and they point to a treasure. Take, for example, a hidden treasure of gold. I think this is Chandogya Upanishad. People who do not know the terrain, even when they pass right over it time and again, would not discover that treasure of gold hidden in the ground. In exactly the same way, all these creatures, it's pointing at you, even though they go there every day to this place where the treasure lies, you're there now, they do not discover this world, for they are led astray by the unreal. Right, so there's always here, and in a world where there are many people who are poor, many people who are disenfranchised, it's the treasure that you always have access to. Well, my main conclusion, I think, is there's lots of different origins of this idea, lots of different developments it takes, and India develops lots of different ways of pursuing it. But one of the most interesting things is that the higher self is itself doubled in the Indian tradition into a self that masters the world, and a self that transcends it, right? It makes me think of Gregory's talk, actually, that there's both a larger outer world connection and a deep and more isolated inner world connection, and you have the option to choose either. So maybe beginning in the idea that the self already in the Vedic, in the earliest cosmologies, was seen as stranded, almost like a spider on a threads that connect to the forces of the cosmos. And that if we use ritual and thought, we can pull on the threads and influence the cosmos. This established a notion that we have the capacity to connect and to influence the world in a much larger way. And this led to a development of an idea that the self is suspended between many worlds. I think it ties in with a shamanic heritage of India. So this is from the hymn of the Kaishans. It's from the Rig Veda. It's very old, older than the Upanishads probably. And it talks of a special group of people with loose, long locks. He with the loose, long locks supports fire, moisture, heaven and earth, supports the elements. He's all sky to look upon, though, and he has long hair and is called this light. The Munis, and this is where that term comes from, girdled with the wind, wear yellow-dyed garments. So this image of saffron figures from the outside of society. They follow the wind's swift course and go where the gods have gone before. Transported with this status, we've pushed on into the wind. You, therefore, mortal men, behold our natural bodies and no more. There is another. Made associate in the holy work of every god, looking on all varied forms, they fly through the regions of the air, on the steeds of the wind. They have a home in both the oceans, in Eastern and Western Sea. At this early stage in India, that means they're going all the way from the Bay of Bengal to the Arabian Ocean. They tread the path of wild beasts. They're not in society, they're in the wild. Male and female spirits, so there's an animist element. They know the wish, a sweet, most delightful friend, and they know who has churned the drink, pounded the stalks, and with long, loose locks, they've drunk the liquid from the cup, along with the god Rudra. This is the soma drink, so there's a drug use, not psychedelic, there's almost certainly not hallucinatory, but very much something that takes you into a higher state of being. Now, there's much more to say. It gets connected to the idea of the sun. The student, interestingly, becomes to symbolize the sun, someone who has access to all of the worlds, who governs the cosmos. And eventually it leads to an idea that if you discover this self, you can master the cosmos. If you find it, yourself, the desires and intentions of this self become real. They achieve complete freedom of movement in all the worlds. And that's in contrast to the transcendental self we usually hear about, which is characterized by light and immortality, dissolution and immersion in something else, which is much more about immersing in the ocean of space, of reality that's all around. And so finally, all of this comes together in one Upanishad that is the greatest influence, I think, on these concepts of mind in almost all the rest of Indian thought, the Mandukya Upanishad, which talks about a quarter of the mind being outward-looking and dealing with concrete things, a quarter of the mind being inward-looking, the imagination, and dealing with imaginal, mental, dreamlike things, and then a quarter that is a single massive perception of bliss, having thought as its mouth, its organ, Lord of all, knower of all, the inner controller and womb of all, the origin and dissolution of all beings. And that's contrasted with a fourth quarter, which transcends all of that, has no connection to anything else. It's without a second, auspicious, tranquil, is not connected to the world. That sense of a world which is master of all, a self which is master of all, and a self which is beyond and transcends all, is a really important distinction that remains in the Indian tradition, and in a sense gives us that idea that the double self is itself doubled at the higher level into a self that is involved in a kind of a power, expansion, a world-facing self, and a self that is about transcendence and escape from all of that. One of the things I like about the Indian tradition is that it doesn't usually tell you you have to do anything. You can choose to be a master of the cosmos. You can choose to sink above or beyond it to the transcendental realm. So it leaves open that chance of exploring the doubled double soul.
Thank you very much. Jessica, can we maybe say that India is different from any other realms of ideas, because they've been doing this for so many more thousand years than we have. So maybe they reached a stage that is more advanced when thinking of this.
I think both that, yeah. I mean, there are at least 500 years more, almost 1,000 years more of thinking about these things than arguably Greece. So be careful about that, because I don't know the Greek history well enough, but there's more history there. I think also what we still don't have an answer to the detective story, where yoga came from. People stopping and doing this very intense, very systematic, long-scale, communal, discursive, phenomenological examination of their own minds. I haven't seen anything quite on that scale anywhere, I think, in history. And I'd be careful to say that, but it's a huge thing, and we still don't know why that happened.
We've been talking about doubles, we've been talking about demons, and now you introduced the doppelganger. Can you very shortly...
The doppelganger
for dummies.
Yeah, good. Doppelganger for dummies. Well, I mean, again, we've got this thing with which there's another self. It's probably a better self, though they don't have you can be in this self as long as you want, no problem. But the other self is, it's immortal. In some versions, it can fly. It can walk with the gods. In the Yoga Sutras, it has magical powers. It has much more energy. It has a whole different life possibility and
very
lifestyle.
much like the demons.
Yeah, in some ways I think
Charles
that's true.
explained to us, yes.
Yeah, exactly. And and one of the nice things about it is you can curate it, you can develop it, you can make it stronger, weaker, develop its powers. So there's a wonderful other life out there for us to lead.
Thank you, Jessica. Nice to have you here.